Reconciliation does not work if one side believes it's some kind of recognition of rights and all that type of thing, and the other side believes it's a benevolent act. Reconciliation is a very human process of us all understanding that we're all human and bringing things back to balance. People ask me a lot of times, how do I contribute? I say, well, the answer might be in this room right here. Because every one of you has had to go through your own human process to reconcile a situation, some of which have been very, very difficult because it may have been people who are very close to you and with deeply divided things between you. And you've had to figure out how to work through that and bring things back to equalness and harmony.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode was a doozy. I am so excited to bring you this conversation that I had with Garry Merkel. Garry Merkel, as you might remember, was on the podcast a couple episodes ago talking about old growth. Garry is a registered professional forester, as well as a bunch of other things. The list of accomplishments goes on and on and on. He has been advocating for First Nations rights and governance for most of his career, and I wanted to bring him on today to get more specific around those things. I wanted to talk to him about reconciliation, about two different cultures clashing and not being able to figure it out, and his understanding and in-depth knowledge about these issues and being able to see both First Nations cultures and Western culture clash and visualize and make sense of why they're clashing and where the miscommunication is happening and why it's happening. And he just provides a lot of clarity, and I hope you guys like it because I found his insight to be both very refreshing and clear and just plain old interesting. So, it was an awesome conversation talking about all kinds of different stuff regarding First Nations people and in relation to land management. So, great conversation. You guys are going to be super into it. I promise you it's a good one. Wes Fraser is the number one sponsor for Your Forest podcast for 2021, and they have been for a few years, and I could not do this podcast the way I do it without them, so I thank them so very much for all of their support and funding throughout the last few years because it just makes this whole thing possible. And Greenlink Forestry is a secondary sponsor, been with me since the beginning, and I also can't thank them enough for all of their support. It's also made this possible. And finally, Damaged Timber. They are selling damaged timber you can put in your kitchen. So check them out to figure out what that is at damagedtimber.com and put in Your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this very philosophical, in-depth, knowledgeable conversation with Garry Merkel, all about reconciliation, First Nations values, land management, forestry. Man, it was good. All right, here we go. I want to start getting to know you a little bit more in depth than we did last time. I want to get your personal story of how and why you got involved in advocating for Indigenous rights and freedoms, and what is it about that drives your passion and just keeps you motivated?
Yeah. Well, I am Indigenous to start with. I mean, this is my community, and until recently, we didn't have much of a voice in Canada. We were like a marginalized community. Judge Berger, when he did the Mackenzie inquiry, he coined a term that I think is really good. He talked about the Indigenous community as a fourth world country, which means a third world country living in a first world country.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, I don't know, everybody thinks Canada is very inclusive, but until, as I said recently, within the last decade or two, the Indigenous community was very much marginalized from the rest of the population in so many ways. And, you know, you go back even a little further, 3 or 4 decades, maybe I should say, as you go back in time, that gulf was bigger and bigger. And today it's closing, and we're kind of becoming part of society. But I think that's what kind of drove me to being involved in this. There's so much richness that we as Canadians are missing out on. And frankly, it's a core part of our culture in Canada that we don't even understand. Like the Indigenous population has so much shaped the culture of Canada. We don't even understand how much it's shaped our culture. So
yeah, or appreciate it. I would think, right?
Yeah,
yeah. No, that totally makes sense. That the fourth world citizen thing is an interesting way to put it. And when I first read your presentation you sent me and it had that in there, it definitely struck a note with me, right? Like, oh, that's an interesting way to just put it forward and just be like, hey guys, this is what it's like, right?
Yeah.
It's it's not only regrettable but embarrassing.
You know, and maybe it's worth it just to talk for a minute about how we got into this place. Because then that helps us understand, maybe gives us some clues on the path forward.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
Yeah. So we're on this path of reconciliation right now, but I would hazard a guess that you would be hard pressed to find a lot of people who really understand what that means and what's their role in it and why would we even bother doing it, and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I'll just, when Canada was first settled by the Europeans, and it was essentially a huge commercial enterprise, the Hudson's Bay, the Northwest Fur Company. There was a relationship between the settlers and the Indigenous population that was very synergistic. Both had come to depend on each other hugely. The Indigenous population came to depend on the goods that the settlers had brung, and the settlers, of course, depended on the Indigenous population to take them out and show them the land and show them where to go and introduce them to people and supply the furs that they needed to do to keep the venture going. And out of that relationship, in fact, we had a whole society emerge, the Métis in Canada, which is a very unique society of blended folks. So but then as Canada confederated, something changed. Like as we started to go into the formal business of building Canada, something in that whole period changed about the perception towards the Indigenous population by the settlers. And this perception developed of these people are really, frankly, dumb, and they don't really fit in society. In fact, there's this whole view, and it certainly permeates through today, of they're not really quite human. They can't build and operate sophisticated society like we can. And so we really need to kind of move them out of society. It's for the good of everybody. And ideally we'd like to try to convert them to us because that would be the best thing for them and for everybody. And so this idea, this paradigm, this way of thinking was what Canada was built on. Confederation built all the fundamental foundations of Canada, and the original treaties and all of the original stuff in Canada reflected this. And it has been reflected in Canada in every law, every policy, every relationship with Aboriginal people since the beginning of Canada. It's so deeply ingrained in the way that we think in Canada that we don't even see it anymore.
Yeah.
We call it systemic racism because it's built right into the system, and it's like the air we all breathe. We all believe it. Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. We don't even question it anymore. It's like part of being Canadian. And so reconciliation is really about making things right. And how do you change that? How do you make it right? And it's a multi-dimensional thing because it exists in every part of our society. And so change involves all of us needing to change in every aspect of our society. And the first step is really understanding that deeply rooted systemic racism, kind of really understanding how it manifests in all of our interactions, and then rooting that out and changing it back to more of a equal human relationship. So that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's something that it's kind of a journey I've been on as well recently, is understanding colonialism, right? And understanding what that means for our day-to-day now, and what decolonization means and all that kind of thing. I'm still learning what these things are, because I feel like if you would have told me, oh, we want to decolonize a year ago, I would have thought that meant, well, let's put all the non-Indigenous people on a boat and send them back to where their ancestors came from, right? But now I understand better that it's about making amends. It's about fixing the problems that the colonized society has created, and try to bring more equity back into the system. And you're right. It's certain things that we don't even question, right? Like I'm sure there's a million different issues, social issues and political issues, and even just access issues that myself am not even aware of, that every First Nations person understands intrinsically, right? Like it's fascinating that I'm happy to see that we're at this point in time where I think you're right. I think we're having more of these conversations, and it's coming to the forefront more. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to you more in depth about this process and what reconciliation looks like. Like for example, one thing that in your presentation you sent me, and it kind of just summarizes what you just said, was that settlement society was characterized by interdependence and respect, and it wasn't until Confederation that all that fell apart. And that was an interesting dynamic for me to recognize, because it was almost like as soon as Indigenous people were no longer of use anymore, they became, second-class citizens, just like that, like kind of almost immediately. It's interesting to watch how quickly society cast them aside.
Yeah, and when you say cast them aside, I mean, I guess that's one way of thinking about it, but it was that they were kind of moved out of society, or we were moved out of society. I mean, we didn't have the right to vote till I think it was the 50s. My grandfather, we couldn't own land. An Indian band still can't own land. It doesn't own the reserves. Those lands are, the wording is held by Her Majesty, or held by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of her Indians. So we couldn't, you definitely weren't allowed to go into a liquor establishment. In some areas, you weren't allowed to travel off the reserve without a permit. It was, and it wasn't just that kind of racial stereotype. There was also a sexism stereotype, or not stereotype, but a prejudice in place at the time. And so it was interesting. If an Indian man married a non-Indian woman, and Indian means status Indian according to the Indian Act. There's rules about being status. And if you marry out twice, all your kids lose status if you marry non-status for 2 generations. If an Indian man married a non-status or a non-Indian woman, that woman became status Indian. If a status Indian woman married a non-status man, she lost her status. So, there was a number of social norms in place at the time that we all have come to realize they were just a huge mistake. They were like, it's almost, you're right, you said earlier, embarrassing. It is a bit embarrassing that we were that before, but you know what? 20 years from now, I think there's going to be quite a few things that we're going to be embarrassed about that we're doing right now.
Absolutely.
That's the nature of evolution of society. And as you get older, like some of the really old established societies, you start to mature to a place where you get less and less embarrassed about what you're doing because you've learned and fixed so many mistakes. But I would say that almost never stops.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention one thing before we move off this subject. You were talking about, maybe put them on a boat and go home. Where I come from, we've been there for 8,500 years.
Right.
So where do we go? I mean, people don't even know where we came from. We know where the settlers came from for the most part. But now we can't send everybody home anymore because they come from everywhere. We are a melting pot. Canada is a melting pot. And, sending people home is kind of ridiculous. The Indigenous population, many of the cultures have been here during and since the last ice age. There is some of the cultures that were here when the ice age was happening. So these are very, very old societies that have developed into extremely mature and very sophisticated, I'll call them, or very complex disciplined societies that really could live in an area. I'll give you an example where the ferry goes in Tawasin. To over to Victoria down on the lower mainland. The estimates are that there was roughly 100,000 people living there for as long as 12,000 years.
Wow.
So I want you to pick any group of people out of this society, put them in an area with no sewer, no grocery store, no police, no property lines, and see how long they can survive. Like you got to have your shit together you got to have something together to do that.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of knowledge that needs to be had in order to pull that off, for sure.
And a lot of discipline, a lot of discipline, a lot of organization, a lot of sophistication.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to point out that as soon as they saw something different that was not the society they had, they assumed that it was lesser than and not as sophisticated and not as knowledgeable, not as scientific. But it couldn't have been further from the truth. It was just a entirely different way of living, right? And they thought it was savages, to put it bluntly, right? But no, these are people who have lived. And something that I've said now that I've learned over time is that from my point of view, I think Indigenous people, they're as much a part of the ecosystem and the balance of our landscape as the grass and the trees and the ungulates. They've been managing and living with this land for, like you said, since the Ice Age or maybe before. And so the fact that we remove them from there and just assumed everything's going to be okay is just hugely problematic.
Yeah, well, there's lots to learn from these cultures. I loosely I grade cultures on a spectrum, or not grade, but place cultures on a spectrum in terms of how they understand their spirituality.
Oh, okay.
Spirituality is spirituality. The simplest definition that I have of spirituality means, how do you take comfort and make sense out of the fact that you are infinitely small in a place you know nothing about, and nothing about that is ever going to change? And us as rational beings, it scares the crap out of us. And we have such a deeply rooted fear of loneliness as a species. We're the most gregarious thing that we know of that has ever existed. We get our comfort by shoring each other up because we think so much. So you can take your comfort in a spectrum of ways. At one end of that spectrum, I can detach myself from nature, and I'm above nature. In fact, I'm so far above nature that God is made in my own eyes. I look like God, and I look the same, and so I'm just totally in control here. It gives me a sense of control, and I build a bunch of religions around that, and we all reinforce that with each other, and that's how we get comfort. Mm-hmm. At the other end of the spectrum, you can totally surrender and be a rock, a butterfly, a speck of dust, and just float around with all the other zillion specks of dust in a completely surrendered place, and just kind of go, wow, this is flippin' amazing, and really work hard at learning how to live in that space. That's the spectrum. Mm-hmm. Almost all Indigenous cultures, not all, but almost all, are deeply what we characterize it, or what I characterize as earth-based, or earth-centered is another word that I've heard, that take their spirituality from their understanding and try to make it as true as possible relationship to the land, to nature, and try to and have a ton of discipline around staying in that place and living in that place. And the idea being is, part of it is you almost have to, because if you don't, you die. You can't go to a grocery store if you screw up on your harvesting. You don't have all the backstops that we have in today's society. So part of it is survival driven, but part of it is knowing that this is who we are as a species. You often see symbols like, totem poles with all kinds of symbols, or a lot of our stuff has symbology with animals. And we don't worship animals in the sense that somehow they're above us, because we are all equal. But we are animals too. And so if you want to learn about yourself, one of the ways you learn about yourself is you look at other animals and understand how they behave. And that teaches you lots about who you are and why you are the way you are. And in fact, all of us as individuals have a deep affinity to some other animal because we behave a lot like them. They're like, I think the word that I hear a lot now is totem. But it's all just common sense stuff is the way I see it. And there's a huge amount to learn from those cultures that we could really use in today's world.
Absolutely. And just to go off on a little bit of a tangent in a different direction here, something that popped into my head while you were talking about the spiritual nature of First Nations culture versus the rational, quote unquote, nature of Western culture. Do you think, I want you to maybe go a little bit more in depth even. I always wondered, is the spiritual nature, has it been romanticized and a little bit more than it actually is? Or do you think that the First Nations culture really is traditionally that tied into spirituality and to balance and to, I'm not sure how to put it, but I want to know that that's actually the way it is, and it's not something that maybe, Western culture took and romanticized in some way or another.
Well, there is an element of that going on. Of course there is. But let's just maybe clear, every culture has its spirituality. Every culture has to make sense out of that core basic fact, our common fear of loneliness, our common fear of the being infinitely small in a place we know nothing about thing. We have to make sense out of that. As human beings, we have to make sense out of that. That's almost like a survival instinct. And so the Earth-based societies take their spirituality from their understanding to land. They're trying to be as real as possible about what's really here. Buddhism is very much an Earth-based culture. Like you see the movies on this, the Tibet movie, I've forgotten the name of it, where the guy wanted to build a movie theater and the monks had to move all the worms before he was allowed to dig, because they aren't going to kill the worms, because everything is equal in the face of nature.
Right.
And so it is true that we tend to romanticize this, and we tend to say, oh God, if you're Indigenous, you must be this or you must be that. But that's, it's like every rule. There's no such thing as a universal rule for any culture or universal thing. Now, the very deep religions, if you live in this kind of a discipline for long enough, you can actually learn to do things that we can't learn to do in this culture. And I don't know how to do all of them. Well, in fact, I don't know how to do most of them, but I do know the odd thing. And I know that there are people who can communicate with animals. I know that there are people, in theory, I know it because it's been explained to me, and I've met people who can speak to the earth and they can hear it speaking back. And I don't know how to explain that, but if you have a culture that's 10,000 years old, and its whole discipline is learning how to be as deeply rooted and grounded in everything around it, you're going to learn things that we're never going to learn in this culture, because we are just not rooted in this culture at all in land. We admire land. We feel like we got to go out to the mountains to feel nature, and we think that somehow that roots us. But nature is everywhere. Nature is everywhere. If you can't feel it anywhere, then you haven't even started the first step down that path.
Oh, that's good.
I love the Mi'kmaq. They got like a system. It's a lot like a karate. When you go into up to black belt and many levels of black belt, they have a whole system of developing people so that they get higher and higher and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then that is the common system. And once somebody gets through that, they have another private system for those who get there to even go further. A lot like monks, let's call it. Yeah. So very, very parallel.
I love that. That's an interesting point. Like, yeah, we in Western society, we go as far as to call nature wilderness, right? We define it differently than everything else, right? It's a separate entity that you have to go seek out. Whereas you're right, like everything is nature, right? It's all around you. But we've created these boxes and now we try to manage these boxes individually. And I think it's only now that we're starting to really recognize that, hey, this is all interconnected and it all needs to be done as one whole, not as separate pieces.
I don't know if we're gonna. Yeah, we may get there eventually. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, why do we do this? And to think of anything as unnatural is a mistake. That's Nietzsche who says that. But you got to say, why do we do that? Why do we think of that? And I've come to the conclusion that it's because we feel guilty. We call something unnatural for two reasons. One is because we feel superior. So nature is that thing over there. And anything we do to it is unnatural. So we're feeling like we're not part of it and we're not part of things. Part of that is guilt. Part of that is a superiority thing. But I'll tell you another little thing a friend of mine used to say all the time, and it's totally racist, but I think it's really good. And he says, the reason you white people have parks is because you can't trust yourself to look after land.
Yeah.
And it's not about white people. It's about this society, and then that's why I say it's totally racist. But the thinking under that is totally true. Totally true. We can't. Mm-hmm. We can't. We will take it and use it because we can, and we will take more than we should, and we don't feel it right away. I mean, we can go and buy strawberries from the grocery store. We can go get meat. We don't have to depend on it day to day directly. So if we screw up, we can get it from somewhere else, in theory. Mm-hmm. And nobody does the larger math, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody's paying attention to our ecological footprint as much as maybe we could or anything like that. So at the larger scale, we just keep running a deficit, but nobody keeps track until we actually have to face the music. Like now with climate change, we have to face the consequences. Mm-hmm. But it's funny that it has to get to a really dire state before we start to do that, because it's not our culture to think like that. Yeah. This culture.
Yeah, we don't think ahead. We're not worried about the future so much for some reason. It has to be proof right now that this is terrible and we're all going to die tomorrow. Otherwise, it would be a slow process. Yeah, that brought something up to my mind about because like you said, we Western society puts stuff in parks. We put wilderness in a box and we protect it, and we say don't go in there and don't light fires and don't do anything. Just let it be. Nature will take care of itself. And sure, you could argue that that's partially true, but what is your opinion about, and in relation to Indigenous relationship to nature? Is it possible to? I personally have my own opinion on this, and I think it is. But is it possible to interact with nature and remove resources and replant or remove animals in a is it reasonable to do it at the scale that we're doing it and because I feel like there's this environmental notion of leave nature alone, it'll take care of itself. But I also think that there's a balance that can be struck there where all things can benefit if taken into account and managed appropriately. What do you think?
Well, let's just start with, I don't know any Indigenous culture that I'm aware of that doesn't totally understand that the land is meant to be used. It's how you use it. There's no such thing as protection. I've worked with many Indigenous cultures and tried to find a word for protection. There is no word because it just doesn't make sense. So let me give you an example. Historically, this is common, but I remember once I had the honor of chairing a session in the Yukon where we brought about 150 elders, a lot of whom kind of remember pre-contact from their parents at least. And some of them had grown up traditionally and didn't really know outside society till later in their lives. And we were trying to write a forest policy for the Yukon, and we really needed to blend this perspective in because the Indigenous population is so huge up there. It's a core part of everything. And so I asked him, I said, well, what about, we hear all this controversy these days around predator management and, people being upset because people are killing predators. And what do you think about that? And a couple of the people explained, they said, well, this is the way it is. If you don't manage the predators will kill everything, including you and themselves. because predators become efficient over time. And what they do is they have to eat, right? And so they get to huge numbers where they have to survive. And so they just kill everything until there's nothing left to kill. And then they start dying. And that it kind of goes through a cycle. And then you go through a fairly long drought until things start coming back. And then it happens again and again. And if you're living there as a human, you can't live through those cycles. You, like them, will die off too until things come back, or you have to go somewhere else where it hasn't died off. So very common in our cultures was the practice of cubbing. And what that means is you go into the wolf dens and the bear dens and whatever other predators you have, and you remove a significant number of the cubs in the springtime and kill them. And that way you don't disrupt the dynamic of the pack. You keep them on the landscape because they're an important part of the landscape. The predator-prey relationship is one of the crucial parts that keeps a landscape in balance. And you keep that population stable, let's call it. And so we can all kind of live in a certain balanced situation. If you have that kind of thinking, then maybe, yeah. And it's not, again, it's not about the fact of should you use the land, it's how you use it. And so you have to think differently. Many Indigenous communities right now, there's numerous communities who have been really working hard at articulating their land ethic, their understanding of their relationship, their ethical relationship to land, which is translated into spiritual and religious and et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of things encaptured in that, but I generally call it ethical. You could speak of it as, I guess, religious, but, people get concerned about that. So I speak it more, but as an ethical relationship.
It's challenging when you try to put things to words, eh?
yeah. Well, and so you try to understand that. And then the next step is, okay, what's that look like in terms of how I live with and use the land in my area? And every Indigenous group I know has no problem with having industrial activity on their lands. Now, some more, maybe less than others, of course. But it's how it happens. And so as they develop two things, one, their ethical understanding and articulating that to a place where the community, particularly the more traditional element of the community, goes, yes, that is how it is. And it grows over time because we're relearning it, because of being in this society for a while. Some of us have lost a lot of elements of it. And so we're rebuilding and relearning that. But then there's the other part of translating that into actual management systems and reality and looking after the land and using from that ethical place. We've got systems that have been in place for more than a century now in some places, been operating since the 1920s along this philosophy. We've got a lot that maybe have been in place for 3 or 4 decades, and we've got tons that are being developed over the last decade or two. And they're very, very unique approaches that I think have a lot to teach us. But let me just tell you, this is probably the first time you're hearing about this.
Yep.
As most of society probably doesn't know about this. That just says to you right there, we're two different worlds.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, yeah. It couldn't be more clear, for sure.
Yeah. And we all don't know about it, and we're all trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we're talking two different languages, and we're confused as to why the communication isn't working out, right?
Yeah.
It's very, I understand the frustration, right? And the confusion and the complexity and the overwhelming nature of the issue, because I think people want good things, but like it's just it gets caught up in the weeds.
I'll tell you a story about that. This is a bit of a funny story. I was working with a community in BC here for a while, and we were setting up a co-management relationship with the province. And this community had had a number of run-ins and blockades with the province about forestry in their area. And then I was sitting with them one day. We were trying to draw, okay, where's your territory? And so I brought out some maps and I started talking about stuff and drawing the lines. And then somebody said to me, how do you know the river goes that way? Or this creek goes that way? And I thought, holy crap. So I asked others, I said, does anybody know how I know? And nobody would volunteer that information.
Right.
And I went, oh my God. I said, you know what? I think we all need to learn how to read maps here. And so that we're actually speaking the same language. So I said, next time I come here, I'm going to bring some forest cover maps, topo maps. I had a topo map then, and I taught them how to use the topo map there. But I did bring another one next time. I brought some wildlife, some habitat mapping stuff, some fish mapping stuff, some soil maps. And I was walking. And, you know, this chief, he was telling me, he says, I've told them like 3 or 4 times. I've taken them out on the land. I show them where the deer mate. I show them where this is. I show them everything. And then they just go and still do everything. And I tell them how you have to look after it. And they just go and do everything wrong. He says, and we just can't do it anymore. And so I was showing them. We were on this hill. Their community's on a hill, and we're looking across. And it's an open grassland with tree patches on it. And I started pointing out to them. I said, I tried to explain the concept of these are stands, and I explained over there. But then they weren't really getting it. And then we were standing on this flat with a bunch of grass stands. So I said, well, let's do it right here on this grass. I said, look at this. And I'm walking around the edge of a grass stand. And I'm saying, see how this is different than this? And let's walk around the edge. And they're all walking. And the chief, he looks at me. He goes, that's what a stand is. I said, no wonder we have so much trouble. Like in theory, we're both speaking English, but we're not speaking the same language.
No, it's completely different.
Yeah. I tell many young Aboriginal foresters, I says, most of your job is going to be learning to translate.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just different ways of understanding it, right? And we just take things for granted and we don't. Yeah, I think that's the biggest problem we have is just getting everyone to speak the same language, so to speak, right? Understand the same jargon, understand the you know what I mean? The actual communication that we're attempting to have. It's fascinating that we're still at that level, but I guess it's good that we're starting to figure it out.
It is good that we're starting to figure it out. Understanding is the first step, though. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So I want to. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to tell you one more quick story. I organized a building bridges thing for the Professional Foresters Association here in British Columbia quite a few years ago, a couple decades ago. And a friend of mine, Sophie Pierre, she came and did the keynote. And she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, you know what? She says, I was born in your hospital. I went to your kindergarten. I went to your schools. I went to your Catholicism. I worked in your hospitals. I got trained in your universities. I shop in your grocery store. I go to your dances. I go to all your events. I know every single thing there is to know about you, and you know nothing about me. And that's the root of our problem.
Absolutely.
And I think, oh my God, that is so true. Like so true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't even think I understood. I grew up in Slave Lake, so in the middle of northern Alberta, like surrounded by First Nations. We had lots of cultural events that they came and tried to, incorporate our understanding to what's going on. And I don't think I understood the concept of two different cultures until couple years ago. Like, I literally think that I thought we were all, you know what I mean? Like, our interpretation of what life is different. Therefore, how can the communication not be flawed? Like, it's wild that it's taken me this long, like whatever, 30 years we'll call it, to figure that out.
Well, a lot of Canadians,
and I've been trying to figure it out, right?
A lot of Canadians never figure it out.
Well, that's kind of my point. Is like I've been trying to figure it out the last, we'll say 4 years since I started the podcast. I've been trying to figure that out. And what hope is there for people that, you know what I mean? This isn't on their radar. It's not something they're thinking about. It's not something that they're concerned about. How do you go about getting them to do that? That's a big question. There's always a segment of society that are just willfully ignorant. That's just the way it is, you know. And I don't really want to give any examples on this podcast because you'll probably get death threats on it and stuff. But they're pretty obvious out there. I think people know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
and for whatever reason, they're anti everything, and they're just whatever, and racism. I mean, you know, the thing about racism and sexism and all those isms is every one of those comes from a very deeply rooted insecurity. It's like not being totally comfortable and confident in who you are.
Oh.
So you feel like you need to overinflate yourself almost to be able to make yourself feel comfortable. I characterize it as building your strengths by trying to create weaknesses in others.
It's like the bully thing. It's like the bully thing, kind of.
Yeah.
Like just someone who they may be your friend, so to speak, or your spouse or your whatever, but they increase their own social standing by pointing out your flaws or where you made mistakes in front of other people and laughing at it. It's the same kind of concept, I guess. They're afraid of their own flaws and mistakes and don't want to be seen as human or unperfect. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it comes from deeply rooted insecurity. And so then you say to yourself, well, once you understand that, like one of the important things that we need to understand in this path is that I can't just go poof to you, just the same as you can't do to me, and instantly you're enlightened. And you're just like a new born-again person who totally gets everything and can see everything as a universal citizen and has developed a deep sense of humanity and all those things. That doesn't just happen overnight. It's something you have to grow into and learn. And sometimes you have to even dismantle your whole entire character yourself to be able to do that, which is a bit of a gut-wrenching process. And so, you know, I really like Gandhi. He says intolerance betrays a lack of faith in one's cause. And,
right.
And so I just think if you are deeply intolerant, you really have to ask yourself, why? Like, what is it about me that is threatened by this? Why am I not grounded and totally confident and comfortable in my own space? That's different than being friggin', I don't know. You see somebody raping somebody or something and you are just bored by it and you're going to try to stop it. That's not intolerance. That's something different. That's obviously. And,
yes.
But so I feel like when I see really deeply racist or sexist or whatever people, my first thought is, how do I help them enlighten? How do I help them see a new world? How do I help them grow to where they understand something? I'll give you an example. I've got a good friend. She was from South Africa. She was my EA for a while, executive assistant. And I said, what do you think about this whole apartheid thing? Because she says, well, you know, I just don't know if they should be allowed to vote, she says, because I mean, they're just not ready. They're just not whatever. Eh? And I said, well, let's just think about that for a minute. I said, how many people do you know that are really well educated and smart and understand the total affairs of the country and all the rest of that? I mean, I'd be surprised if you knew any, because most people, what they vote on when they go vote is they vote on, do I have a meaningful livelihood? Is my family being taken care of? Do I feel like the land's being looked after right? And all those things that I care about deeply as a person, I go and vote on those things generally, whatever they are. And for most of the population, those are not those high-flying, sophisticated things that you hear all the smart people talking about on TV in theory, or whoever are involved in that world. For most of the population, it's just a human thing. Well, all those people have families, they care about land, they care about jobs, they care about meaningful livelihood, they care about good relationships. Why would they be any less qualified than the whole rest of the bulk of the rest of the population? She says, exactly. Yeah. And when she gets it, right? Now she can begin her path of undoing that. And I said, and you know, you really got to think about, why do you even think like that? You've been conditioned to think this, that they're lesser than for some reason when it's actually a mistake. And so she spent the rest of her years trying to undo that and unravel that.
That's
right.
And a moment of enlightenment, Sometimes just this talk between friends, right? That's all it takes. Yeah.
Sometimes it's more gradual, but whatever it is, you know, whatever gets you going on that path, I call it the emperor has no clothes. You ever, that fable, the emperor has no clothes?
No, I don't think I have. I've seen the movie, The Emperor's New Groove, but I don't think that's related.
This is an old fable, and it's a fable about an emperor who heard about this amazing tailor, and this person just made the most amazing stuff. So he went to see the tailor and said, "I want the most beautiful suit that you have ever built for anybody." And the tailor said, "Sure," and the emperor left, and a whole bunch of things happened where the tailor couldn't get to it. Plus the tailor just couldn't think of, the most amazing. So when the emperor came, the tailor just went, "Okay, take your clothes off," and then pretended to put a suit on the emperor. And the emperor looks in the mirror and says, "I don't see anything." He says, "Well, this suit, everybody sees it the way they see the most beautiful thing ever." He says, "Let's call in one of your people and see." And so he calls in and the emperor says, "What do you think?" "Well, this person's scared to death of the emperor." So they say, "Oh, it's beautiful. Oh my God, I've never seen anything like it." And so the emperor goes and he does it. He takes this off, puts his own stuff on, and goes. He puts it back on, and the tailor comes and puts it on him for a parade. He's going to show everybody, and he's going everywhere, and everybody's saying the thing. "Oh my God!" Until a little kid says, "Hey, the emperor's got no clothes." And then everybody gets embarrassed. But after that, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
This is what I see this a lot. Like, once you see it and it touches you, it's really hard to unsee it.
And all it takes is somebody to have the patience enough to maybe point out what you might be missing, and for you to have the capacity and the willingness to actually listen and absorb what they're saying. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, sometimes it can happen over a period of time. Well, it generally does happen over a period of time because you're often asking questions in yourself. It's like you just got to think about the way you are personally. You're often asking questions of yourself internally until finally something just kind of snaps and you go, "Okay, yeah, Like, and it could be an exchange or an interaction. It could be whatever it is, but something kind of triggers and kind of goes, okay. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Building understanding is the first step in overcoming all those isms and building a higher level, broader understanding. I just characterize it as enlightenment, and then translating that into your behavior and actions and helping others maybe on their path, if you can, is kind of the more long-term work that has to happen. And that's the work that, the people like myself and many other people are involved in, is that kind of work. Not just with the Indigenous community, but, once you start seeing this kind of thing in anything, you can't not deal with it. Gandhi has another one of my favorite things is the truth is still the truth, even if you're a minority of one. And so if you know it to be true deeply, and I can't force you to understand it, but if I know it to be true deeply and I can share it and people internalize it and go and take it and explore it further and develop it deeper, then obviously it was probably true, I guess. Who knows? Truth is a slippery slope. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I do know the truth is that we are all equal in the face of nature. Yeah. Nature has no rules. Nothing's good or bad in nature. Nature just is what nature is.
That's right. That's right. It's interesting that all of these concepts, to me, when it comes to reconciliation and when it comes to even just the broader sense of being, the best possible land managers we could be, I think everyone needs to do this work and to ask these questions of themselves and of their fellow professionals and friends and family. And it is only through that type of insight, through that type of introspectiveness, that we can all come to the table and create a new land management system that is beneficial for all, while, also heightening First Nations culture and First Nations rights and bringing everybody to the table to not have them be a fourth world nation anymore. You know what I mean? A fourth, or what did you say? You said it was a fourth world citizen. Fourth
world, third world and a first world country. That's changing. Yeah. That is changing, though. This is really not about reconciliation. Does not work if one side believes it's some kind of recognition of rights and all that type of thing, and the other side believes it's a benevolent act. Reconciliation is and that's Murray Sinclair, by the way, who quoted that. Reconciliation is a very human process of us all understanding that we're all human and bringing things back to balance. People ask me a lot of times, how do I contribute? I say, well, the answer might be in this room right here. Because every one of you has had to go through your own human process to reconcile a situation, some of which have been very, very difficult because it may have been people who are very close to you and with deeply divided things between you. And you've had to figure out how to work through that and bring things back to equalness and harmony. And so you may have answers because this is a deeply human process. It's true there are some legal elements in it. It's true that there's policy elements in it. It's true that there are opportunity elements in it. Like we have to create some space and opportunity. And it's true that there maybe are other more what I'd characterize as technical, we can do things elements, but a huge chunk of this journey is human. And that part, which is the hardest part, is stuff you can potentially contribute to, just if you think about it for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I often get the question when because people will ask me like, oh yeah, what's your podcast about? It's like, oh, it's about forestry and land management and that kind of thing. And then they see that I have an episode talking about, talking about Indigenous issues or talking about residential schools or something like that. And they're like, what the hell does that have to do with forestry? And I'm like, that has everything to do with forestry. We're on this.
Has everything to do with
has
it.
everything to do with it. But people sometimes find it difficult to draw that connection. But for me, it's a very deep and spiritual thing, being able to manage the landscape. And if I'm going to be responsible for managing the landscape, I want to know that I'm getting it right for everybody, not just for me and my values, right? And I think that's kind of the quest that this podcast is on, is trying to get these truths out that otherwise, people in positions of power may not be aware of, right? They may not be having these conversations or may not be privy to understanding this, right? And so I'm really excited at the opportunity to have conversations with someone like yourself who's done the work to understand both sides of what's going on and sees very clearly where the problems are and maybe even has some understanding of how to begin to get out of it, because it's clear that you've done that work and you were very heartfelt in it.
Let me just tell you a little thing. I call it face your demons. This is how land management tends to evolve. The way we manage land is we have a certain ethic, a management ethic. Right now it's let's just say a few years ago even, it was all about take everything we can. If you're living in a controlled depletion ethic, you set a target like maybe 150 years, and you say, okay, I'm going to take a 1/150th every year, because in 150 years I'll figure out some stuff, and by then I'll have options or whatever. That's controlled depletion. That was the earliest forms of kind of a thinking forward sustainability kind of thing. Well, then you start doing that for a while, and then you go, holy crap, this might not be working. And more important, people start beating the crap out of you for it because they don't like what you're doing. And they're starting to realize, often way before you do as a manager, that this is not working. And they beat you up. And now we have a whole period of guilt, blame, conflict, anger, until finally we collectively do something I call face your demons. And you go, oh my God, the demon isn't each other. It's us. It's the way we think. We need to grow. We need to evolve. And so we work at that for a bit. We come up with a new construct, and then we implement that. And then we go through the cycle again. We implement it for a while, and it's all shiny new pennies till it starts to show itself as a problem. And then we go through the conflict cycle again. And it's that cycle. It's a very tough cycle. Well, I advocate building two parallel paths. One is the development of your land ethic, and the other is developing the associated management systems that go with that. And they're both equally important. But let's just think about a culture that has spent 10,000 years perfecting its understanding of relationship to land and has built it into every aspect of its culture and has a huge discipline around it. I think that we might be able to learn one or two things out of that, as opposed to the culture that we're in that's all about worshiping, frankly, money and what we can take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny when you put it that way, right? Because it's just, it just puts it in such stark contrast. We're like, hey, assholes. Look, okay.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but there's things to learn here. Yeah.
That's because you're nice, Gary. That's because you're nice.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true that sometimes you kind of need a bit of a slap in the head, but you know, as I said before, everybody has to enlighten at their own speed and their own path. Hopefully we can make it in time, but if we can't, then that's equally amazing too, if you worship nature truly.
Well, it's almost like the enemy is comfort and content, Like people get comfortable in the system that they grew up in and they know, and so they're comfortable with that. And anyone comes along to tell you that, well, you need to shake things up because I'm not comfortable, I'm not content with my situation, and they go, well, you're just whatever. You don't matter. You don't understand how complicated things are, how different they are, and you just don't have the knowledge to understand what's going on. So we'll just ignore you, or whatever. maybe that's rude. Maybe that's a really intense way to put it. But my point is, no. I think as human beings, we tend to we find comfort and contentness in our lives as we grow older, and we have cushy jobs with family that's, doing well. And it's hard for us to admit that the system might not be working out for some people and to need to shake it up. But yeah.
The Lakota have a saying about this. We do not fear the things in the dark, yet we fear the dark. We do not fear the search for the truth, yet we fear the truth. Mass denial is a survival instinct in human beings. If we were to face every one of our demons all at once, we would go flippin' crazy when we live in this world, because we just couldn't handle that much truth at once. We have so many demons that we can't. We have this rational thing, and unless you have a whole culture that's built around exposing that and dealing with that every single day, all the time, as an individual, you can't do it. As a culture, you would go crazy. You would frankly be committed at a mass scale if we had to start dealing with domestic violence, living unsustainably, and all the things that we do as human beings to reinforce each other and to not push ourselves to reality, the truth. We will take a little bit of a step towards the truth, and we'll say, oh yeah, that's great, let's do that. And then we'll do that for a while because we're all okay with that, but we're never okay with going to the full version of it. That just is too much for us. It is a survival instinct, I've come to believe. And it's just because of our rational mind. I know this is a bit philosophical, but again, it speaks to the fact that this is an evolution or an enlightenment process. It requires a huge amount of discipline and uncovering, relearning, building new ways of living that fit that new way, and never being content, just really focusing on continually growing and learning and shifting societal paradigm over time. And trying to build new ways to live with that new paradigm. Things like climate change force us to do it. They just absolutely force us to do it. But you can do it voluntarily as well. There's many cultures who have. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting that it all comes down to that in the end. Well, Garry, we only got 10 minutes left before you got to go. And we didn't really get to some of the stuff that I was hoping to get to. I want to get to one day, maybe in a few months' time, we'll reconnect. I want to get to some of these more concrete examples you have of Indigenous land stewardship and forest management from Indigenous people that you have these examples of, and get more specific about what that looks like in these community forests and that kind of thing, because I think those specific examples are things that are fascinating and people are going to want to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I don't know of all of them. I'm really seriously looking. I'm trying to start a new project right now where we start to actually share those amongst ourselves as Indigenous communities and start to learn from each other at a mass scale. Because we are all working at building them. In British Columbia here, we just recently adopted the DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which says that we're going to conform to the principles of UNDRIP in everything we do in British Columbia. One of the consequences of that is that we are now working towards building collaborative management relationships between Indigenous communities in the province, throughout the province. We already had quite a few kind of started, but that means now that we have to start now meshing different ethics, land ethics, and different systems. And many communities who haven't worked through the process are trying to figure it out. We're all trying to figure it out. We're all building models, but we need to rise that up a level and start
Gary,
sharing with each other and learning from each other and teaching each other and accelerating that process now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's exciting stuff, and I think I was hoping to get to it today, but we kind of went off on a tangent. Although I think it was a productive and interesting tangent that people will learn from. So
yeah, it was.
I appreciated the philosophical nature of it, and getting a little deeper into your mind.
Yeah, well, you said you wanted to get in there. It scares me when I get in there. I don't know what the hell it does for you. It's like, oh my God. Yeah.
Well, while you were talking, it was like every time you said, "I'll give you an example," I got excited because your examples just became so concrete and clear, and I was like, "Oh, this is awesome! This is good podcasting right here."
Well,
so yeah. No, I loved every second of it.
That was fun. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for this, Gary. I really, really appreciate it, and we're gonna have to do it again here soon. Woohoo! Thank you, everybody, for listening. That was insightful, to say the least. Thank you, Gary, so very much for all of that. I think we could have done that for quite some time, and I look forward to talking to you again, getting more specific about stuff in the future. Like I said, there's a lot more knowledge in that old brain of yours to be tapped and put out on display on this podcast. So I appreciate your participation. It was great. I hope you guys liked that. If you have any questions for me or Gary, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you. And with that, we'll see you guys in a few weeks. Make sure to rate and review. Tell your friends, tell your family, get it out there. Every little bit helps. Seriously, I'm terrible at this promotion stuff, so you guys got to do it for me. It's the least you can do for free content, right? Come on. All right. Catch you guys next time. Take care.